What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our top 40 wide receivers for week 11 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And of course, let me know who are your starting wide receivers as we move into week 11. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, number one overall, we've got Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. What an extraordinary game for JJ on Sunday against the Buffalo Bills. Literally probably the best catch I've ever witnessed in my entire life. Right up there with the helmet catch by David Tyree in the Super Bowl against the Patriots, and with Odell Beckham's one-handed infamous catch, right? So amazing skill by JJ on a week in, week out basis. But from a fantasy perspective, he is your wide receiver number 3 overall, and the rankings are a little bit skewed this week, right? Because Cooper Kupp is not expected to play. He is dealing with an ankle injury, so he is out of the picture for the week. And Justin Jefferson, even going up against a tough Dallas Cowboys defense, that Dallas Cowboys defense didn't play that well last week against the Packers. So I just love what JJ's doing right now. 35.3 fantasy points in week 10, 193 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I expect this to be a competitive game overall. So we've got CeeDee Lamb pretty high in the rankings at number 3 as well. But Justin Jefferson, I think, is a top tier number 1 overall receiver as we move into the week. At number 2 overall, we've got Stephon Diggs. He, in the same matchup as Justin Jefferson last week, recorded 24.8 fantasy points, 128 receiving yards overall, 12 receptions. He comes in as your wide receiver 2 overall so far on the season. He gets the Cleveland Browns. It's a good enough matchup. Stephon Diggs, doesn't really matter what the matchup is. I expect Diggs to continue balling. He had a phenomenal game. He just gave JJ a ton of props. Stephon Diggs, also one of the most elite receivers in the league. So Cooper Kupp, at the end of the day, while we're here, right, comes in as your wide receiver 4. He moved back a couple spots with just 2.9 fantasy points, -1 receiving yards on the day, and he got the ankle injury, so he is out of the picture at the moment. Keep in mind, here in week 11, we've also got the Buccaneers, the Dolphins, and the Jaguars on bye week, so no Christian Kirk, no Mike Evans or Chris Godwin, and most importantly, no Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle. Tyreek Hill is coming in as your wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. Finished with just 15.4 fantasy points in week 10, but he has still solidified himself as a number 1 overall receiver in fantasy. Jalen Waddle is your wide receiver 6 in fantasy football, finishing with 10.6 fantasy points in week 10. So we've got quite a few big names not on the list. But moving forward, we've got CeeDee Lamb at number 3 overall. A monster performance in week 10 for Lamb, his best fantasy performance of the season. 38 fantasy points, 150 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. He gets a good matchup with the Vikings. Like I said, when we were talking about JJ, this should be a competitive game script overall. So I really do like CeeDee Lamb as we approach the week. DeAndre Hopkins continues to be productive on a week in, week out basis, regardless of if Kyler Murray is on the field or if Colt McCoy is on the field. Hopkins racked up 98 receiving yards in week 10 against the Rams, finished with 19.8 fantasy points. I expect him to continue to produce on a weekly basis. We had the Bengals on bye week in week 10, but I've got T. Higgins pretty high on the list. He's up ahead of Devontae Adams and Chris Olave, who have tougher matchups overall. T. Higgins gets the Steelers. His secondary has been abysmal. He's had double-digit fantasy points every game he's played in this year, except for week 1 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, awkwardly enough, where he had 4.7 fantasy points, but we have no Jamar Chase here in week 11. And in week 5, I don't even consider that a game he played in, because technically he was on the field for 16% of snaps, but we all know the story there. He wasn't actually healthy. So regardless, he's had a great season, and I expect him to continue to be productive against a Steelers secondary that is lacking. Devontae Adams is your wide receiver 5 in fantasy. He had a monster week once again in week 10 at 27.6 fantasy points, 126 receiving yards, and a touchdown off of 9 receptions. I won't be surprised if he's a little bit higher at the end of the week, but it's a steep matchup against a Denver Broncos unit that has played very well against opposing receivers. He gets a steep matchup with Pat Surtain. With that being said, in week 4, he had 19.5 fantasy points against the Broncos, but I'm a little bit weary because I just feel like that Broncos defensive unit could definitely pop at any moment. On top of that, this Raiders offense as a whole looks very sorry. All right, Chris Olave coming in as our wide receiver 7. Finished with just 7 points in week 10. A disappointing performance to say the least, but really this offense led by Andy Dalton was struggling all day long. Listen, Jalen Ramsey's going to be on him in certain times of this game, but at the moment when Jalen Ramsey is not on Chris Olave, I expect him to get plenty of targets and be plenty productive within this matchup. A.J. Brown comes in as our wide receiver 8 for the week. At the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, but he's coming in as your wide receiver 9 at the moment. I expect him to have a good game against the Commanders. So far on the season, he only has one game where he has not scored double-digit fantasy points in full PPR. A.J. Brown's a monster. He absolutely deserves to be in the top 10. All right, I kind of went back and forth for numbers 9 and 10. Debo had a kind of down week with 7.1 points against the Chargers, but I expect this game script against the Cardinals to be pretty productive from a fantasy aspect overall. So I like Debo this week, but I also really like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's moved back up to wide receiver 14 on the season and really bounced back nicely against the Chicago Bears in week 10. 22.1 fantasy points, 11 targets, 10 receptions, 119 receiving yards, but the Giants have played well against the wide receiver position. So I went back and forth with Debo and Amon-Ra. I think they're pretty interchangeable. I think Amon-Ra is going to have another nice week, and I think Debo could reach a better ceiling as we move into week 11. All right, moving into the next 10 receivers, we've got Amari Cooper against the Buffalo Bills this weekend. It's absolutely crazy when you look at Amari Cooper's fantasy stat lines for the year. Every away game except for week 7 against the Baltimore Ravens, where he had 10.4 fantasy points. He's had single-digit fantasy points in every home game. He's had double-digit fantasy points. I'm not going to get too spooked ultimately by Amari Cooper. This should be a competitive game script against the Buffalo Bills and a game script where the Browns presumably will have to throw the football. Overall, Cooper had 6.2 fantasy points in week 10, just 32 receiving yards off of 3 receptions, but I think he'll have a chance to bounce back in week 11. Tyler Boyd, on the other hand, should have a good opportunity against the Steelers, so I've got him pretty high on the list. Allen Lazard absolutely disappointed us in week 10. I really thought he would have a better game, but we saw Christian Watson absolutely shine against the Cowboys. Lazard finished with just 7.5 fantasy points, 45 receiving yards off of 3 receptions, but he draws a really nice matchup against a Tennessee Titans secondary that has played really poorly. Speaking of them playing poorly, Cortland Sutton last week had 12.6 fantasy points against the Tennessee Titans, 66 receiving yards off of 6 receptions. He faces a Las Vegas Raiders team that is not playing good football whatsoever defensively right now. So Sutton comes in as our wide receiver 14. DJ Moore absolutely disappointed. Well, I don't know if he absolutely disappointed, but he didn't play well in week 10 against the Atlanta Falcons. But once we knew this was going to be a really bad weather game, we kind of moved more as more of a sit going into the week. But he finished with just 6.9 fantasy points, 29 receiving yards off of 4 receptions. But the Ravens defense ultimately on the year has not played well against the wide receiver position from a fantasy perspective, so I've got him pretty high. Brandon Ayuk comes in as our wide receiver 16 for the week. He's our wide receiver 18 so far on the season, at 12.4 fantasy points against the Chargers in week 10, 84 receiving yards. So I continue to like Brandon Ayuk as a wide receiver 2 and or flex option for you guys. Deontay Johnson finished with double-digit fantasy points in week 10 against the Saints in full PPR, 10.3 fantasy points, 63 receiving yards off of 4 receptions. Should be in a competitive game script. I mean, week in, week out, these Steelers are just in competitive game scripts where they need to play from behind and throw the football. So I think Johnson will have some good opportunities. I've got Joshua Palmer as my wide receiver 18 for the week, but he was really underwhelming in week 10 against the Niners. I mean, really, this Chargers offense was as a whole until Mike Williams and or Keenan Allen comes back, which I really don't see happening this week. I just don't know what to make of these Chargers receivers, but he gets a good opportunity against the Chiefs, a team that is allowing for a lot of points to the receiver position. He had just 7.4 fantasy points in week 10, 8 targets, 3 receptions, 44 receiving yards. So in his last 3 starts, he's had 8 or more targets. He's just not ultimately being consistent with those targets. But let's face it, it was just not a good night on Sunday Night Football for the Chargers as a whole. So I think he'll be able to bounce back in a game script that we should see a lot of offense out of both sides. All right, Terry McLaurin gets the Texans in week 11. Not a great matchup, and at the time of recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, so I don't have a stat line for week 10 for Scary Terry, but regardless, he's been pretty consistent on the season. He's had double-digit fantasy performances every game of the year except for weeks 4 and week 6, and week 10 still up in the air at the time I'm recording this. So ultimately, I see a pretty productive stat line out of McLaurin. All right, number 20 overall, we've got Darnell Mooney, who really disappointed us in week 10, or I think he could end up a lot higher on this list, but he drew a great matchup in week 10 against the Lions, finished with just 9.7 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 57 receiving yards. He gets another really good matchup against the Falcons in week 11, so I won't be surprised if he finishes a little bit higher. But with the underwhelming performance last week, and let's face it, another week where Justin Fields was just running all over the field, Mooney is a little bit lower on the list as we approach week 11. All right, moving into receivers 21 through 30, Rondale Moore starts the list. He had another very productive week in week 10, even with Colt McCoy at the quarterback position. 18.4 fantasy points. That makes for 3 double-digit fantasy points in a row for Rondale Moore. Not a great matchup against the Niners, but he continues to be productive enough on a week-in, week-out basis. Since week 5, he's only had 1 single-digit fantasy performance. He continues to be a player I really like in the flex. Jacoby Myers has played very consistently overall on the season. Only 1 start this week where he has had single-digit fantasy points in full PPR, but he draws an extremely tough matchup against Sauce Gardner, so he is a little bit further back. Gabe Davis had a phenomenal week against the Minnesota Vikings in week 10, 21.3 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 93 receiving yards, and a touchdown. But on a weekly basis, he just brings a lot of boom or bust at the position. We don't exactly know what to expect out of Gabe Davis on a weekly basis, so he's a little bit further back on the list. If you look at the last 2 weeks, he had 5.3 and 5.5 fantasy performances before week 10, and then in week 6 he had 16.4, week 5 he had 32.1, week 4 he had 2.3. I mean, he's completely all over the place, but we know when Gabe Davis hits, he hits, so he continues to be a flex option. Devonta Smith really in that same tier as Gabe Davis, on an extremely productive offense, an extremely talented player, but on a week-in, week-out basis provides us with a lot of boom or bust. The upside is always there, but the risk is always there. At the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, so I don't know how he's going to fare in week 10, but he had his best game of the season week 3 against Washington. Listen, guys, I'm all for Devonta Smith, but he is a flex option on a weekly basis and an option that provides you with a lot of risk. All right, Michael Pittman makes the list here. He had 12.3 fantasy points with Matt Ryan at the quarterback position in week 10 against the Raiders. 9 targets, 7 receptions, 53 receiving yards. I actually expect Michael Pittman to get back on a pretty consistent routine, but not a high ceiling. He has a tough matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, but this will be a game script where the Colts need to throw the football, so Pittman should see enough volume to provide a respectable fantasy stat line. Allen Robinson, on the other hand, is going to suit up more than likely unless something drastically changes as the wide receiver 1 for the Rams, as Cooper Kupp is expected to miss some time with that ankle injury. He gets a pretty decent matchup overall against the Saints. Depends on how Marshawn Lattimore decides to play. So Robinson, due to volume, makes the top 30, but overall is still a little bit of a shaky start. All right, George Pickens had a nice day in week 10 against the Saints. 14.5 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 32 receiving yards, and a rushing touchdown. I mean, Pickens has had some inconsistency over the last couple of weeks, but overall since week 4 he has 4 double-digit fantasy performances and 2 single-digit fantasy performances, so he absolutely deserves to make the list here. But just understand he does bring some boomer bust potential. Garrett Wilson has played well over the last 2 starts for the New York Jets. He had 17.5 points in week 8. 17.9 points in week 9, then a bye week in week 10. But this is a pretty steep matchup against the Patriots, and this game is in Foxborough, so I don't necessarily think there's going to be great weather. He's still a strong flex option, but just understand there's some risk due to the matchup overall. But I do think that the Patriots will ultimately try to limit and probably be successful at limiting the run game for the Patriots. So I do expect some pretty good volume for Wilson. The question is, what does he do with it for the week? All right, the Chiefs receivers, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, but we'll start things with Mecole Hardman, who could be out in week 11 as he missed week 10 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But if he suits up with Juju Smith-Schuster expected to miss week 11 due to concussion protocol, I expect Mecole Hardman to be the #1 receiver for the Chiefs in an explosive overall matchup against the Chargers. We know when these two teams play each other, there's a lot of offense. So I like Mecole Hardman coming into the week, but we'll talk more about the Kansas City Chiefs receivers in a few seconds here. Michael Gallup gets a good opportunity against the Minnesota Vikings. Really the reason I have him so high, so to speak, when he hasn't necessarily performed very well the last 2 weeks, sitting at 7.5 fantasy points in week 10 and 8.9 in week 8. He was on bye week in week 9, is because I expect this matchup between the Cowboys and Vikings to be a good competitive game script. He still carries a lot of risk, but overall I think he has a nice opportunity for a good stat line in a game that should provide us with some good offensive production. All right, moving into 31 through 40, I've got Terrace Marshall first here just because it's a good matchup against the Ravens. Let's just scratch week 10 for these Panthers and Falcons receivers. It's a rain game, those awful conditions, right? But in the 2 starts before that, Terrace Marshall's had 14.3 and 12.7 fantasy points. Now, the only asterisk here is Baker Mayfield is set to start at the quarterback position, which could affect some of the production for Terrace Marshall, but they did connect in week 9 for a touchdown. So I'll keep Marshall here, but understand he also brings a lot of risk. Kadarius Toney comes in next, and I really could see Kadarius Toney finishing higher overall. He had 19 fantasy points in week 10 against the Jaguars, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 57 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Once again, this game script against the Chargers should provide for some good offensive production. So I was very tempted to put Toney a little bit higher on this list, but with the uncertainty at the position for Toney, I've got him a little bit further back. I want to see more of a consistent sample size overall, but the future for Toney with the Chiefs looks absolutely bright. DeAndre Carter comes in next. He had a nice week overall in week 10 with 16.4 fantasy points against San Francisco, 4 targets, 4 receptions, and a touchdown. That's now 2 double-digit fantasy performances in a row for Carter. It kind of feels like he is making more of the opportunities that Justin Herbert is giving him. So I like Carter in this matchup against the Chiefs, a team that has not played very well against the wide receiver position on the season. Next up, we've got MVS in that same matchup. I mean, purely due to this matchup, we've got to have all these receivers on both the Chargers and the Chiefs in pretty high fashion. But overall, MVS 15 fantasy points in week 10, 2.2 in week 9, on bye week in week 8, then 14.1 in week 7, then 0 in week 6. He's very inconsistent, but he should see more production as we expect Juju Smith-Schuster to not play in this game. Ultimately, I like Mecole Hardman as the primary receiver for the Chiefs this week, and I like Kadarius Toney as kind of that upside type play. MVS is a pure boom or bust flex play, but he should definitely see some production within this matchup. All right, it feels like Darius Slayton is the most productive receiver on the Giants at the moment. He has double-digit fantasy points in his last 3 games. He's only rostered in 9% of fantasy leagues, so he should absolutely be picked up. He was dropped due to the bye week in week 9 in a lot of leagues. I know a lot of you guys are leaning towards Randall Robinson, but he's been kind of trending down the last 2 games, so Slayton should absolutely be a must-add player from the waiver wire perspective, and draws a really strong matchup against the Detroit Lions as we move into week 11, so he could definitely finish higher up on this list. All right, Curtis Samuel comes in next. At the time I'm recording this, Monday Night Football has not been played, like I've said several times now, so I don't have a stat line for you guys, but he has double-digit fantasy points in week 7 through week 9, and he is your fantasy wide receiver number 19 in full PPR overall. He's having a good season. I expect him to have a good week in week 11 against the Houston Texans, although that defense has played pretty well against the wide receiver position on the season. All right, Donovan Peoples-Jones is a receiver we've talked about a lot here at the channel as a waiver wire option week in and week out. He comes in as your wide receiver 46 on the season, but since week 4, he's only had one performance with single-digit fantasy points, and he had his best performance of the year in week 10 against the Dolphins with 14.9 fantasy points, 5 receptions, 99 receiving yards. It's a tough matchup, but this should be a game where the Browns need to throw the football, so I like DPJ as a flex option as we approach the week. Chase Claypool had a really down week in week 10 against the Lions, a very disappointing week. We felt like he was going to be a nice streaming flex option. We'll give him another shot here against the Falcons, a good matchup again. But if he did not perform against the Lions and he does not perform against the Falcons, I don't like him in the coming stretch against the Jets, Packers, a bye week, the Eagles, and the Bills. So we'll see what he does this week, but we'll give him a shot here in the top 40. Adam Thielen, on the other hand, gets the Cowboys this week. I like this matchup overall, like we've discussed, but overall the ceiling for him has been pretty low the last 2 weeks. 9.9 fantasy points in week 10, 9.7 in week 9 when he had double-digit fantasy performances in 4 of his last 5 matchups. But I like this matchup against the Cowboys. It's a tough matchup on paper, but should be a good competitive game script for Captain Kirk and company, so Thielen still makes the top 40. All right, I got to put Brandon Cooks on here because he is the #1 receiver on paper for the Houston Texans, although Nico Collins outperformed him from a fantasy perspective in week 10. So Brandon Cooks makes the list, but you guys know I really have not been a fan of Brandon Cooks in recent weeks. He had 8.2 fantasy points against the Giants, 7 targets, 4 receptions, 37 receiving yards, but he gets a much better matchup this week against the Commanders. Let's see if he makes the most of it or not. All right, right outside the top 40, I'm going to give you guys a couple streaming options, a couple flex players to take a look at who may or may not be available in your league. But Paris Campbell, coming in at 27% rostered overall, has seen a ton of volume with Matt Ryan at the quarterback position. Matt Ryan and Campbell have good chemistry. Tough matchup against the Eagles, but the Colts will be forced to throw the football ultimately in this game. Drake London just misses the top 40, but I was really impressed with what he did in that rain game against the Panthers. After such a strong start to the season between weeks 4 and week 9, Drake London recorded single-digit fantasy performances every week until week 10 in that rain game where he had 14.8 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 38 receiving yards, and a touchdown. It'd be really nice to see London get some more overall volume. He's a very talented player, but ultimately he has come up short in the last couple weeks, so he misses the top 40. Isaiah McKenzie had a pretty nice week in a competitive game script against Minnesota with 9.5 fantasy points as a desperate streaming option, but we know that he brings a ton of inconsistency, but because he's on the Bills, he kind of makes this outside tier. Christian Watson had an extremely productive week with 32.7 points in week 10, 3 touchdowns, 107 receiving yards. He gets a really good matchup against the Tennessee Titans, but he's been extremely disappointing on the season before week 10 and wildly inconsistent. So let's see if we can get a productive sample size out of Watson as we approach week 11. Nico Collins, who we just talked about, outscored Brandon Cooks in fantasy in week 10, 15.9 fantasy points. He had more targets with 10 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and a touchdown, but he has been wildly inconsistent on the season, so he is outside of the top 40. But don't get me wrong, he could easily outscore Brandon Cooks once again here in week 11. Devin Duvernay has really been disappointing whenever he is expected to line up as the wide receiver 1 for the Ravens, which he will probably be doing in week 11. He's really only been productive when he's been thrown in as the wide receiver 1 and we see another receiver exit the game. So overall, I don't love Devin Duvernay against the Carolina Panthers in week 11, but ultimately it's not too bad of a matchup, so he's still right outside of things. Jahan Dotson is definitely worth a look. Monday Night Football has not happened at the time I'm recording this, in case you guys didn't hear, but Dotson is returning in week 10 and absolutely a player to keep an eye on. In his first 4 starts of the season before getting injured, he only had 1 game where A, he did not score a touchdown, and B, he did not have double-digit fantasy points. He had 4 touchdowns through the first 4 weeks of the season, so I like Dotson. Now, that 1 game he didn't score was week 3 against Philadelphia, and he plays Philadelphia on Monday Night Football. So I don't know if he's going to bounce back right away. But in the next coming weeks, he has Houston, Atlanta, and the Giants. So he should have some opportunities to be productive overall. Randall Robinson, your last desperate streaming option. He's been extremely disappointing the last 2 weeks with just 3.5 fantasy points in his last 2 starts, but he draws a good matchup against the Lions. So at the end of the day, he's worth some consideration in deeper leagues, full PPR leagues if you're absolutely desperate. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And please let me know what wide receivers you are starting as we approach week 11. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.